The Uber tier is defined by housing the most powerful Pokemon of all time. At least that's how it's supposed to be. However, once in a while, there are Pokemon that will technically rank Uber, no one actually uses them. So let's explore that. Reshiram. Most box art legendaries are top tier, especially in the gen that they were introduced. It's really rare that a Pokemon isn't. However, this is the case of Reshiram, a Pokemon who never really had success. Even in his debut gen, his flaws were very evident. He's very susceptible to hazards. He's weak to both ground and rock. Also, he's very much in a crowded speed tier of 90, filled with other powerful titans like Kyogre and Groudon. However, unlike those two, he doesn't have particularly great stab moves. For the fire, he has Blue Flare, which is only 85% accuracy. Overall, the top threats in Gen 5 Ubers like Kyogre, Groudon, and Latios all had a direct type advantage or good coverage over him. It's also faced with major competition with Kyurem White, who also has an insane offensive stat, but outspeeds him at 95 speed, and has arguably a better offensive typing in Dragon and Ice, with better moves in Ice Beam and Fusion Flare. Things didn't exactly get better for him as more Pokemon outsped him as the gens went on. Even older Pokemon like Tyranitar could usually switch into literally any one of the attacks. Currently, he has sitting at 0.18 usage rate. Even Pokemon like Petarant have a higher usage rate than him, at 4.51%. This thing gets very easily revenge killed by most Pokemon, and currently Koraidon greatly outdoes him. Koraidon might not be a fire-type special attacker, but his ability, which summons Sunny Day, basically makes him an honorary fire-type, and it's much better than Turbo Blaze. He outspeeds him, and he gets walled by literally pretty much every single Pokemon in the tier. Next is all the bad Arceus forms. Arceus is a great Pokemon, but most of the types Arceus can be aren't actually very good. Now, I'm not going to go into detail for every single one, but usually if an Arceus type sucks, it's because of one of these or a mix of several of these factors. Number 1, poor defensive typing. The most popular Arceus forms tend to be the ones that are good defensively. For example, Arceus Steel, Ground, and Water comes to mind. However, Arceus Grass, Ice, or Psychic, typings like that, which have lots of weaknesses and are very vulnerable to hazards, aren't usually going to be used. Because unlike other Uber Pokemon, because they are holding plates to their corresponding typings, they cannot hold boots or any other items. Also, even if the typing isn't too bad defensively, they could also just outdone offensively by other Pokemon, especially if other Pokemon have a good secondary typing. For example, Dragon isn't necessarily a terrible defensive or offensive typing, but there are tons of other Dragon types in the tier that can apply more pressure than just an Arceus with a Dragon Plate. The only Arceus form which can semi-escape this logic is Arceus Normal, because it has that very unique combination of Extreme Speed, Swords Dance, and Terra Normal. Next is Archaludon. Archaludon is a Pokemon banned from the OU tier because it was far too devastating, specifically because of rain teams. The keyword being used is rain teams. See, after Archaludon was banned because of Electro Shot being a one-turn move in rain, plus his ability Stamina, he was introduced in the Uber tier. However, rain teams aren't particularly common in Gen 9 Ubers. Kyogre is still present, yes, but most teams that have Kyogre aren't rain. And especially the fact that Miraidon was at one point dominating the tier didn't help him. And even after he was gone, Koraidon was still a huge thorn by his side, since his ability directly challenges Kyogre's ones, and he can do major damage to him via low kick. Archaludon doesn't specifically fit well on any popular teams, because most teams, like I said, just aren't rain. It's also terribly slow, and it's weak to common Pokemon, like I said. Koraidon, Arceus Ground, and Ho-Ho. Gen 9 Ubers is simply not a hospitable environment for him. Next is Deoxys. Deoxys is a definition of a glass cannon. Terrible bulk, but has the capacity to be a KO machine. One look at him and you can see why he would be terrifying on a hyper offense team. But no one uses him. Why? It's very simple. Deoxys' attack is literally just him, but with a higher attack stat. It's very simple, there's just not much to it. It's just literally that meme of Daniel versus cooler Daniel. There's no reason to use a normal Deoxys form. Dialga and Dialga Origin. Dialga used to be an S tier Pokemon in its debut gen of Gen 4. It had a great typing, good bulk, and great moves both offensively and utility-wise. He was a fantastic Pokemon, as he was the only Dragon type that could actually dish out and tank Draco Meteors. So what happened? Well, unlike other Pokemon, Dialga doesn't have traits that can specifically say are bad per se. He just got majorly power crept. Ho-Ho got Regenerator, Primal Kyogre became a thing, and so did Primal Groudon. And there was just generally Pokemon that could take him on that got introduced as the gens went on. New Pokemon kept popping up, like Mega Blaziken or Mega Metagross or even Necrozma Duskmane, who completely one-upped Dialga in all senses. While he was a dragon and had a bulky steel typing and able to set up Stealth Rock, another Pokemon got introduced that could do that too, and he had Prism Armor, that is Necrozma Duskmane. Dialga's defenses were always what set it apart from other Pokemon, but now that Necrozma Duskmane was introduced, he didn't really have a spot on any teams. He's a pretty low speed, much like Reshiram, and it became more and more of a problem as the years went on. There was just Pokemon that were a great answer to him, and he wasn't a great answer to many. Same can be said for Dialga Origin, who is essentially the same Pokemon, he just doesn't have the same competitive history as Dialga, but he has literally the same thing. The only difference is that he has a boost and a special defense stat, and he has to hold the Adamant Crystal. And the Adamant Crystal isn't exactly terrible necessarily, it gives a boost to his Dragon and Steel type moves, but because he has to hold it, he can't hold any other items, which restricts him a lot. Overall, not impressive. Next is Espathra. Espathra is a Pokemon who, like Archaludon, was banned from OU. Espathra was pretty much a one-trick pony, but it did that trick pretty well. It would basically sweep via a combination of Calm Mind, Speed Boost, Stored Power, and Dazzling Gleam. It could easily snowball into a win condition, so why isn't it good in Ubers? Well, first of all, let's look at its stats. While it can snowball into a win condition, it's not particularly fast, which means that after one turn of getting speed boosted, it can still be outsped by other Scarf threats, and offensively, it's not very menacing. It relies heavily on Calm Mind to be able to actually apply pressure with Dazzling Gleam or Terra Blast, which means that it's super susceptible to taunt because it's also very reliant, besides Calm Mind, on Protect and Roost and Substitute. It's one of those Pokemon that were great in OU but fall short in Ubers because the power level is simply too high. Next is Gouging Fire. Gouging Fire was an absolute menace in Gen 9 OU. It was suspect tested multiple times before it was actually banned, but ultimately it got a super one-sided vote of 91% to ban. Gouging Fire was a very difficult Pokemon to answer because of its bulky Dragon Dance set, which usually comprised of Morning Sun, Flare Blitz, and Breaking Swipes, and a filler move. This combination was specifically deadly. Breaking Swipes helped neutralize other physical attackers, and Morning Sun was great for reliable healing in a gen where Sun is super common. It was also, along Pokemon like King Gambit, one of the greatest abusers of Terra. It was really hard to try to figure out which Terra type he was going to go for, Fairy, Dragon, or Water, or Fire, etc. It was extremely overwhelming, so it got banned. You would think that this combination of moves and attributes would make him equally as good in Ubers, however that's not exactly the case. There is a Pokemon who is essentially just him but better, which is Koraidon. Koraidon isn't a simple fire type, but as previously stated, he's an honorary fire type basically, who always uses fire as his Terra type. In conjunction with his most commonly spammed moves being Flare Blitz and his ability to summon Sunny Day, there is no reason to use Gouging Fire when you can use Koraidon. Next is Kyurem White. Kyurem White, I talked about him very briefly before, is usually considered better than Reshiram, and that's true, but that's still a very low bar. It doesn't mean he's good himself. In his debut gen, it wasn't all bad. He had an extremely spammable move of Fusion Flare and Ice Beam, like I said, as well as not being subjected to the common speed ties of the base 90 legends. So why is he considered a useless legendary? Well, very similarly to Dialga, more and more Pokemon were introduced that could pretty easily check him or tank his moves. For example, one of its strongest points was its Draco Meteors, off that huge special attack stat, but after that, the Fairy type got introduced, so it became much less spammable. And currently, Pokemon like Eternatus and Necrozma Duskmane, or Koraidon, Arceus, Granization, are all Pokemon that he needs to watch out for. Ultimately, base 95 speed just doesn't cut it, and while you can Scarf him, he doesn't really have a reliable way to boost his speed other than Dragon Dance. But he isn't really a physical attacker, he's a special attacker. And when it comes to ice attackers, Shampoo greatly outdoes him, having arguably a better stab typing of Ice and Dark. Next is Landorus. Landorus is one of the best Pokemon in OU of all time, but he had a different journey in the world of Ubers. In Gen 5 Ubers, he was actually relevant enough as a common choice Scarfer, since at that point 101 speed was really impressive, so it would often either run Swords Dance sets or just Scarf the Choice Banded ones. It became very evident he wasn't going to cut it eventually though, because of his very low defenses, both specially and physically, and a 4x weakness to the most commonly spammed type in Ubers besides Dragon, that being Ice of course. So defensively, it doesn't really have much to offer, and as for a physical ground type attacker, it gets outdone by Groudon or Earthplace Arceus. He basically went from a frail Pokemon who could outspeed many Mons and function as a good wall breaker, to now currently being a ground type that gets outsped and outdone and falls very easily prey to the most common defensive cores like Ho-Oh and Necrozma Duskmane. Next is Lugia. Lugia used to be the great wall in Ubers, so it could ward off foes like Groudon and Rayquaza, and while it does have great natural bulk, it could also function offensively. And eventually, its hidden ability was introduced in Gen 5, and her whole role was cemented now as a Stallmon. It had access to multi-scale, which is great like I said, but the thing is about being a good defensive Pokemon is that you have to have a good defensive typing. And while Psychic used to be absolutely goated, nowadays it's pretty terrible, and not a very good defensive typing, and not good offensively either actually. as well as the fact that it's a flying type, so he pretty much has to run heavy-duty boots in order for multi-skill to even be effective as a wall. So generally defensively, it gets outdone physically and specially by Pokemon like Skeledridge, Chansey, Blissey, and Dondozo, and its stats aren't enough to justify its presence on any team particularly, because its typing is really just sad, and Ho-Oh greatly outdoes it both defensively and offensively. Because of Regenerator, next is Magearna. Steel and Fairy is almost universally acknowledged as the best typing in the game. It also has one of the best move pools in the game. Those reasons were the ones that it got banned from OU in Generation 8. So why isn't it very good in Ubers? Well, Steel and Fairy are good at typings, yes, but there's another Pokemon called Zacian who has the same typing and is far more menacing, with a huge attack and speed stat. Speed part is important, because that's one of Magearna's biggest flaws. Magearna is strong, but it's very slow at 60 base speed, especially by Uber standards. It's also very easily checked by Ho-Oh, Eternatus, and Groudon, who are all very common. And its special attack is impressive by OU standards, sure, but by Uber standards, it's not enough to make it stand out. Next is Necrozma Duskwing. Necrozma Duskwing is another rare box art legendary that didn't exactly make a splash in its debut generation. It was outdone majorly by Necrozma Duskmane, who has the ability Prism Armor, and Lunala, who has the ability Shadow Shield. Because those factors, it often functions as a less impressive version of them. And because of its low speed, it can't really cause a lot of trouble. And because its ability is offensively oriented, powering up super effective moves, it really does need a good speed stat. And another issue is its Psychic Ghost typing. Ghost is great offensively, but not in conjunction with Psychic, because that means that it has a 4-time weakness to Dark. And since historically Pokemon like Marshadow and Yveltal were everywhere, that made it very difficult to just exist. And even now, when those Pokemon aren't even present, Dark is still a very commonly offensive typing. Next is Mewtwo. Mewtwo once was the most broken Pokemon of all time in RBY Ubers. However, it has fallen very low. Since then, Mewtwo is a Pokemon with an impressive speed tier and a special attack stat, sure, with good moves, but that's all it is. It really seems like it's enough, but it's not enough in the world of Ubers. Mewtwo has a good speed stat of 130, and that's impressive, but it's outsped by other Pokemon like Koraidon and Fluttermane. It also doesn't have a particularly impressive ability. It has an okay one in Pressure, but Mewtwo functions as a wall breaker or an all-out attacker. Pressure doesn't benefit it offensively. It also has a very unimpressive typing in Mono Psychic, leaving it very vulnerable. I also feel as though because he should primarily function as a wall breaker, he suffers a lot from the 4 move slot syndrome. It wants to run Psy Strike, Flamethrower, Ice Beam, Grass Knot, Earth Power, Focus Blast, Recover, and etc., and it doesn't particularly stand out as a special attacker. Next is Ogerpon Hearthflame. Ogerpon is another Pokemon banned from OU. It's honestly a pretty similar story to Gouging Fire, just with a few factors being a difference. It's a Pokemon that is strong in OU, but can't keep up in Ubers. It had a very difficult set to keep up with at the time, a mix of Trailblaze and Stomping Tantrum, Hornleech, Play Rough, and Ivy Cudgel, Swords Dance as well. But this set is just pretty easily counterable in Ubers. It isn't nearly as impressive in OU, with Kyogre being the only pure water type, who can already take him out with Origin Pulse. The most popular Pokemon in the format, Koraidon, also resists its stab types. It's very easily outsped by the majority of Pokemon. 110 speed is impressive in OU, but in Ubers, it's a little lackluster. It's a Pokemon that is actually often used in Ubers UU, because the most popular Pokemon in the normal Ubers format can deal with it pretty easily. Next is Palafin. Palafin has a pretty turbulent career so far, originally being OU legal, then going to Ubers, and then being temporarily unbanned for a while, then going back to Ubers, which just goes to show how good he is. Palafin has a decent typing and with a really impressive stats, but the thing is that he needs to switch out to have access to that, because of his ability Zero to Hero, where he starts out as a really nothing Pokemon, then when you switch out, you basically get a legendary Pokemon. He has a good move with Flip Turn to help him out, as well as Wave Crash and Jet Punch. He also has a Bulk Up Drain Punch set, which made him very difficult to deal with because of the recovery aspect. And it might seem like it's not worth wasting a turn, but you basically get a Pokemon that's legendary level stats on your team. So why isn't he used in Ubers? Well, it's pretty simple. You need to switch out to get access to that legendary Pokemon. However, Ubers is a format filled with already legendary Pokemon, so you can just use them instead of having to waste a turn. Next is Palkia Origin. Palkia has a very similar story to Dialga. In its debut generation, it was a pretty amazing Pokemon with a cool stab typing, having Spatial Rend. And because of that typing, it was also defensively impressive, having a quad resist to Water Spouts, from the mighty Kyogre. But honestly, there isn't much to say. It's a very similar story to Dialga. Honestly, the majority of other Pokemon just got power crept as well. It's a very niche wall breaker now, but nothing else. And mostly it faces competition, particularly from Eternatus, who can also take on Kyogre very well. And has an even better Dragon type move and Dynamax Cannon, because guess what? It doesn't miss. Next is Shaymin-Sky. We all know those glass cannons that were pretty iconic, like Alakazam and Gengar. Those who have frail stats, but managed to still be very impressive. Well, Shaymin-Sky isn't really one of them. In its debut gen, it had a cool grass type typing that was pretty impressive. It let it deal with Kyogre and Groudon, so it was very impressive, as well as a good speed stat that let it outspeed most Pokemon. But its weaknesses are pretty evident. It's very, very frail and weak to hazards. If you're using Shaymin-Sky, hazard removal is really important, and even priority attacks can kill him. Currently in Ubers, the Pokemon that are absolutely amazing, powerhouses, aren't frail, and this one cannot take a punch at all, so it's obsolete. Next is Sneasler. Sneasler is another poor OU mon that couldn't cut it in Ubers. Sneasler is a glass cannon that was very overwhelming in OU, mostly because of Dire Claw. It's basically the same story all over again, but in Ubers, it's very easily dealt with. It's a big fish. It was a big fish in a little pond, and now it's a little fish in a big pond. He doesn't hit hard enough to justify his presence on a team, and he gets outsped by other strong Pokemon and choice scarfers. Next is Solgaleo. There is absolutely no reason to use this Pokemon when Necrozma Dusk main is X. It has worse stats, a worse ability. There is nothing that he can bring to the table that Necrozma Dusk main can't. Necrozma Dusk main makes up for his kind of weird typing of Psychic Steel with his ability. Solgaleo has none of that. Next is Ursaluna Blood Moon. This Pokemon was banned from OU, but the reason he isn't used much is pretty straightforward. Ursaluna Blood Moon is a ferocious Pokemon who can dominate basically everyone. So why isn't he on every team? Well, that's because he has a terrible speed stat. He needs to be on a Trick Room team to function, and Trick Room teams in singles are very gimmicky. That means that he's a gimmicky Pokemon. Next is Zekrom. Zekrom was a Pokemon that for the longest time was greatly outdone by Miraidon, and now that he was banned, people still don't use him. See, Miraidon didn't need a boosting move to be immediately effective. He does at 90 base speed, a crowded speed tier, and a very underwhelming stab dragon type move in Dragon Claw, as well as a signature move in Bolt Strike with fairly low accuracy, which makes him a fairly inefficient physical attacker, which means that lots of times people actually try using a special set. Unfortunately, his most powerful stat is the physical one. He's also very easily bothered by Groudon, and the only reason to use him is as a Dragon Dance sweeper, but Pokemon like Rayquaza do that much better. Those are the Pokemon that I consider useless in the Uber tier. Feel free to correct me or name more if you think that I'm wrong.